It began in the dead of night, far from the tourist-filled harbors and the glowing skylines of the Pacific Rim. Out beyond the shipping lanes, under a moon dimmed by heavy cloud cover, a line of shadows moved across the water, too quiet for a commercial convoy, too deliberate for fishing trawlers. The sea barely rippled as the silhouettes slipped forward, hulls painted in non-reflective blues and grays, their radar signatures reduced to the size of a lifeboat. On the horizon, a U.S. Navy P. 8 Poseidon aircraft banked slightly, its crew scanning the vast expanse with infrared sensors. What they saw was enough to send a coded message up the chain of command. China's stealth fleet had crossed the line. This wasn't the slow-motion build-up intelligence analysts had warned about for months. This was movement calculated, coordinated, and directly into waters both Washington and Beijing had privately agreed were off-limits without prior notice. Within hours, the Situation Room in the White House was active, the glow of screens casting pale light over tense faces. President Trump, back in office and surrounded by his top national security team, leaned over the map projection, tapping the area with the blunt end of a pen. "This is she testing us," he said, his voice low but sharp, "and we're not going to pretend we didn't see it." For months, Chinese naval activity had been shifting away from the predictable, the coast-hugging patrols, the occasional power projection sail-throughs, the carefully staged exercises in the South China Sea. Instead, the People's Liberation Army Navy had been refining something new, a dispersed network of stealth-capable corvettes, miniaturized destroyers, and unmanned surface vessels designed to slip past traditional detection grids. The aim was simple but dangerous, the ability to project force deep into contested areas before adversaries could mobilize an effective response. And tonight, they had just demonstrated that they could put that capability to sea in numbers that raised the stakes overnight. Intelligence from the Indo-Pacific Command painted a picture of a fleet operating without the usual radio chatter, communicating through tight-beam encrypted bursts almost impossible to intercept. Analysts noted the timing, just after a joint exercise between U.S., Japanese, and Australian forces had wrapped up, leaving a temporary gap in patrol density. Xi Jinping's government had been silent on the matter, issuing only vague statements about routine maritime training in international waters. But satellite imagery told a different story. These ships weren't training. They were moving into positions that could threaten key choke points, the Bashi Channel, the Miyako Strait, and even approaches to Guam. The implications were immediate and chilling. For years, military planners had worried about a gray zone scenario in which China could move assets into strategically sensitive waters without firing a shot, creating a fait accompli before the U.S. could act. Tonight, as the data streamed in and the dots appeared on the tracking screens, it was clear that scenario wasn't theoretical anymore. Trump's warning to his team was blunt. If we wait until they're inside the wire, we've already lost. The tension wasn't just about the location. It was about what these stealth ships represented. Unlike China's massive, attention-grabbing aircraft carriers, these vessels were designed to be ghosts. They could loiter undetected, gather intelligence, deploy undersea drones, or even deliver missile strikes with minimal warning. They were the naval equivalent of a knife slipped between ribs, silent until it was too late to stop. Across the Pacific, Allied capitals were waking up to urgent calls. Japan's Prime Minister convened a midnight meeting of the National Security Council. Australia scrambled its maritime reconnaissance aircraft. Taiwan, already under constant pressure from Beijing's military flights and warship patrols, put its coastal missile batteries on high alert. In Manila, the Philippine Navy redeployed 2 frigates closer to contested reefs. But it was in Washington where the most critical decisions were being weighed. Was this an incursion to be answered with an immediate show of force? Or was it a deliberate provocation meant to lure the U.S. into overreacting, giving Beijing a propaganda victory? Trump, listening to the back and forth between his admirals and intelligence chiefs, cut in with the single directive. We're going to make sure she understands this isn't 2020. This is 2025, and the rules have changed. That line, later leaked to the press, would dominate headlines for the next 48 hours. But inside the secure walls of the Pentagon and the White House, it wasn't about headlines. It was about the uncomfortable truth that in the dark waters of the Western Pacific, the margin for error had just narrowed to almost nothing. The following morning, while most Americans were still pouring their first cup of coffee, the Indo-Pacific theater was already locked in a silent contest of nerves. U.S. satellites tracked the Chinese stealth fleet weaving through the gaps between island chains, each vessel's position updated in real time on classified maps. From high above, they looked like pinpricks of light slipping through a black fabric, but in reality, each one carried enough firepower to sink a destroyer or shut down a shipping lane. President Trump's voice carried over a secure line to Pacific Command. "I don't care if they're painted with Hello Kitty. If they get within 100 miles of our carriers, you treat them like hostile craft." It was blunt, but everyone knew the underlying message. Xi Jinping's gamble wouldn't be allowed to play out unchallenged. What made this different from past standoffs was the speed. China's stealth fleet wasn't just about invisibility. It was about compression of timelines. In war games, analysts had seen that traditional detection to decision windows, the hours or days needed to identify, track, and respond, could shrink to mere minutes once these ships were in range. And the Chinese weren't alone. Shadowing them, though at a cautious distance, were Russian naval intelligence vessels, their own sensors drinking in every byte of data. Putin, publicly silent on the matter, had quietly ordered his Pacific assets to observe and evaluate, knowing that every lesson China learned could be of use to Moscow in its own maritime disputes. The dance on the water was mirrored by the storm on land. Trump spoke twice with Japan's Prime Minister that day, then with the Australian Defense Minister, laying the groundwork for a coordinated response if Beijing pushed further. The question was what further meant. She hadn't crossed into territorial waters yet, but his fleet had moved into exclusion zones that U.S. planners considered essential to controlling Pacific access routes. Every hour they stayed there without consequence risked normalizing their presence. In Beijing, state media carried grainy footage of the stealth vessels in open water, accompanied by triumphant music and captions about safeguarding maritime sovereignty. It was a script the Chinese public had seen before, except this time, the ships were operating far beyond the so-called 9-dash line, in waters the international community recognized as open but strategically vital to the U.S. and its allies. The propaganda was aimed as much at the West as it was at domestic audiences, a show of reach, resolve, and defiance. In the Pentagon, defense analysts combed through signals intelligence, looking for patterns in the fleet's movements. Were they probing for gaps in radar coverage, testing reactions from nearby forces, or were they simply showing they could operate this far out without being intercepted? Each possibility carried its own risks, and none of them were comforting. Trump's advisors floated options ranging from aggressive shadowing with U.S. destroyers to a full-scale freedom of navigation operation designed to force the stealth fleet to maneuver. But every option risked an escalation spiral, and in the confined geography of the Pacific's island chains, even a near miss between warships could trigger a crisis. Meanwhile, Xi's strategy seemed almost tauntingly patient. The fleet never massed in one place long enough to be cornered. Instead, small groups of vessels would appear on one side of a strait, while another cluster slipped through a different passage hundreds of miles away. It was a shell game at sea, one that tied up massive U.S. surveillance and escort resources just to keep track of the pieces. Trump, briefing reporters at the White House, avoided inflammatory language, but made his position clear. We know where they are. We know what they're doing, and they know we're watching. If they think we're going to sit back while they push, they're mistaken. Off the record, aides said the president had authorized measured forward presence, a term that translated into carrier strike groups taking up positions just over the horizon from the stealth fleet's known routes, ready to close the distance at a moment's notice. And while the public saw only flashes of this contest, those inside the command centers could feel it. The air was thick with the awareness that one wrong move could turn a shadow war into a shooting war, faster than anyone could call it back. By the third day, the confrontation had settled into a tense rhythm, U.S. forces tracking, shadowing, and occasionally signaling the stealth vessels, while the Chinese maintained radio silence and unpredictable maneuvers. Yet beneath the rhythm, the potential for chaos remained high. At 0430 hours local time, a U.S. Navy destroyer detected a fast-approaching contact, less than 12 nautical miles from its position. The contact's radar profile was minimal, almost indistinguishable from background noise, but visual confirmation through night optics revealed the angular, knife-edged hull of one of Xi's new stealth corvettes. For a moment, the bridge went silent except for the hum of electronics. Then came the order: hold course, maintain readiness. In that moment, every sailor on deck knew how easily it could turn into the first real exchange of fire. The corvette veered off without incident, but the message was unmistakable. China was willing to press dangerously close to U.S. assets. In Washington, President Trump convened an unscheduled national address, speaking directly to the American people about the situation. His tone was measured but firm. We will not be intimidated in the Pacific. We will protect our allies. We will defend our waters, and we will respond to any threat with the strength required. It was both reassurance and warning, not just to Xi, but to anyone watching from Moscow, Pyongyang, or Tehran. Putin, for his part, issued a carefully worded statement through Russian state media, calling for all sides to exercise restraint, while simultaneously praising China's commitment to securing its maritime interests. It was classic Kremlin signaling, urging calm while fanning the flames, just enough to keep the U.S. off balance. Back on the water, the stealth fleet began to pull back in small increments, a move some analysts interpreted as a test complete, others as a feint before a new phase. The Pentagon wasn't taking chances. Trump authorized an expanded patrol grid, ensuring that if the stealth ships returned, they would face an even denser screen of detection and escort. Yet even as the immediate danger seemed to ebb, the larger implications of the encounter began to sink in. China had just demonstrated that it could move a stealth-capable strike force deep into contested waters, hold their position for days, and disengage without direct confrontation. It was, in strategic terms, a proof of concept, one that would factor into every U.S. and Allied naval plan for years to come. Trump, in a private meeting with senior naval officers, reportedly summed it up in a single sentence: "We saw the future, and it's already here." The lessons were sobering. Stealth technology wasn't just about avoiding detection. It was about forcing adversaries to spread their resources thin, to remain on high alert indefinitely, and to make decisions under constant pressure. She had gambled that the U.S. would hesitate to escalate, and for now, that gamble had paid off. But in the quiet aftermath, as the Pacific returned to its deceptive calm, both sides knew the contest was far from over. The next time the shadows moved across the water, the stakes could be higher, the timeline shorter, and the margin for error gone entirely. And for all the public statements, the real conversation among those who had watched this unfold was far simpler, almost whispered. If this was just the rehearsal, what would the opening act look like?